Welcome to Polygon Division. This tutorial comes as a request from a team subscriber. They asked about the new particle system in Cinema 4D and if I could melt an object. You sure can, and I'm going to show you the easy approach. But before I do that, I want to mention some important things to consider. In Cinema 2024.4.1, Particle Engine is not a complete tool set, but you can expect some serious updates in the near future, we can hope. It lacks many features like true particle-to-particle interaction like springs and constraints. You can kind of fake it with their flock solver. There's no flip or fluid PBD solving, therefore you have to fake the liquid effect. You're not going to get that nice, chunky, interactive physical melt that one might expect. Consider Insidium X particles for more realistic movement. If you'd like to see a tutorial on making a few variations of a complex redshift goo shader, post in the comments below. When working with heavy particle scenes, you must do a hardware preview to get real-time playback so you can check your work. These are viewport renders, also called play blasts. Remember to cache your scenes before rendering. This prevents rendering errors and frame skips. This also allows you to render just parts of your sequence, otherwise you'll have to render from the first frame. Boo. One thing I want to mention when rendering particles for clients, make sure you have good management. It's easy to fidget around and waste precious time. Trust me, I've done it. I want to personally thank everyone that's been giving feedback. I've read all and considered incorporating these topics into future videos. I've gotten a few questions like, why don't you do this and why don't you try that? Well, my main reason is the lack of allotted time per video. I'm trying to keep the videos under 30 minutes and not getting into the weeds of details. But if there's something you'd like me to cover in more detail, post in the comments below. I'd like to mention this solution I've developed of melting objects isn't the only way to achieve this effect. It's just a way of keeping the project easy to understand for those that are new to particles, while keeping the watch time reasonable. Of course, I implore you to come up with your own solutions and techniques. This video is meant as a jumping off point to making your own wild creations. With that being said, let's melt. Okay, so for this first phase, we're going to set up our scene. On the floor object, you right-click, simulation, and you're going to click the collider object. That'll come in useful in a little bit. And then I've got the melt text, which is not set properly because if I was to emit particles from this, what would happen is it would only emit from one character because it's not one polygon structure. And I've got the default settings on my object here, and I just extruded it out a little bit. I believe it's set to 25, so I'll set it to 35. And I've also got outlines showing. And what we need to do is we're going to come in here to the subdivisions, get this to make a box. So I'm going to go to adaptive and change it to subdivided. And I set this to 2 or 3. That looks good. Now, if you have curved text, this is just block text, but you'll need to adjust the angle. You want even spacing. Now, the face of this polygon is not going to work either. We want an even remesh on this. So I found the best one to use remesher with is this Delaunay. And let's go ahead and remesh it. So I'll come in here and say remesh and hold down Alt, and that will remesh it and set it into the correct group. That looks good. With our floor, I've subdivided it 20 by 20, the X and the Z. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us more polygons so that we don't have particles falling through the floor. The next thing is I'm going to go to edit scene settings, and I want to mention something. Make sure if you have a graphics card that this is set to GPU, and that if you have multiple cards, set it to the faster card. And you're going to go to particles, and if you get particles that are falling through your geometry, you might need to change the substeps a little bit. But because we're doing a melt, those particles are not moving fast, therefore the substeps should be fine at 1. If the particles fall through the surface, you're going to want to turn up the substeps, and just be careful that you don't crank these values. You just try increments of 1. So if it doesn't work, try 2, then try 3, and try 4. But it significantly slows the playback time. And I've set up my workspace to have all of the properties and tools in this column. And the way you do that is you can take your simulate dropdown and go into the emitters, add the emitters, conditions, modifiers, and then go to the customize palette, say new palette, and then drag your buttons in the correct order that you'd like them, and then drag this palette into the panel, side panel that you want. And you can place them at the bottom. You can place them however you'd like, but that's what I did. Makes it much easier so I don't have to go into these drop downs. I don't like doing that. Okay, so the next thing, now that we have a remesh that looks like nice quads, you can see it's nice and even. We're going to right click on it and say current state of object. That'll keep the original and then give us 4 text objects. And this is what I'm talking about. See how there's are separate. When you make text, they're treated as separate pieces by default. So if I was to use the emitter, it would only emit from the M. So I'm going to take all of these text elements. I'm going to say connect objects and delete, gives us one. And then what I'm going to do is I've already got one saved here. But I'm going to open up my archive null and drag in my remesh into the archive. And I can also disable it, close it, lock it down. We don't need this null. And I'll call this text mesh. So here's our text mesh. Looks good. And as far as the height on the floor, it's set to 6. And so what I do is I do half of 6 is 3. And then I gave it just 2 millimeters below that to give a little bit of space because the particle distance. So you can see that the ground is right here. So it's just slightly lower. So the first thing we want to do is we want to emit from this object. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the mesh emitter with the text selected, say mesh emitter. It adds it into the group. And what we get is we get the emitter itself and then the particle group, which is just a filter. It's a folder that you put elements into that allows you to control effects and kind of isolate them. So with this, if I just hit play, I'm going to turn off the text element. I'm also going to turn off the floor so we can see. They're just emitting, and that's not what we want. So what we'll do is we'll go to the emission, and I'm going to say shot because we want to just shoot a bunch of particles and then leave them in their place. So I'll set this to 550,000, and then if I play it, we're now just shooting a bunch, and you can see they're coming off the polygons. What we want to do is we don't want to emit from the surface. We want to emit from the volume of this object. So that will fill this text mesh with particles. And now we get an explosion. So the next thing we want to do is we want to go to properties and we don't want speed. So I'm going to set this to 0. I'm also going to set the color of the particles to a bright green for goo. And let's see what we get. There we go. Now, if I was to mesh this, I'd run into an error because of a couple things. These are being positioned randomly inside the volume. And what we want when we remesh this is to have flat faces to make it look like it's not made from particles. So to do that, when we selected volume, you have this voxel size. I'm going to set it to 2 and we want it to be as a grid, not random. What that's going to do is it's literally going to make a grid. So if I come in here to the front view, you can see there's a grid of particles. Now, if I zoom out, you can see there's little nooks taken out, missing particles. And that's because to describe the volume, we have it set to 2. And if I set this to 1, you're going to see more notches taken out. See that? And that's because of the particle count that we have set cannot be described by volume of 1 centimeter. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and set this to 100,000 and there you go. So you can see now we don't have any space. But if I go at a different angle, you can see there's particles still missing. And to prove this, what we're going to do is ultimately we're going to do a text mesh, a volume mesher on this. So let's do that now to check our work. So you're going to go up to the volume and we're going to add a volume builder and a mesher. Put the builder inside the mesher. And you might be tempted to add the emitter into the volume builder, but actually use the particle group. So we're going to drag the particle group in and there we go. So I'm going to set the voxel size to 2 because that's what we set our particle voxel size to. And when you select the volume builder and you go to the particle group, you have this radius. And what that does is it treats each of these particles as a radius of 15. That is ridiculously large. We want to set it to 2. And you can see the surface has notches taken out of it. And that's because there's missing particles. So what we'll do is we're going to adjust the emitter count to get rid of that. So I'm going to go up to 150,000 and see if that works. 1, 2. Let's go a little higher, 200,000. You have to hit back and there you go. So for my scene scale, which is default at the text size default and the volume builder, the way it's working, that the count to get even surfaces is 200,000. So there you go. So now it looks just like the original text. And what we're going to do is when we start adding more particles to this, we're going to be bringing down the voxel size. And then what we're going to do is on the volume builder, once we start adding more particles, we're going to be bringing this down to get even tighter pixels. Okay, so here it is. I'm going to leave the floor invisible for now. And what's great about this setup is that let's say you want to do two titles that melt, you're just going to replace in the mesh emitter this text link. So if I add another object like this, go to the emitter and drag in the new shape, and then it'll add the particles to that object. You can see there it is. So super easy to swap out. Let's drag it back in. So you notice to reset the scene, you have to hit the back button. You cannot drag the playhead. You have to hit the back button, which is the far left play button, and then go 2 frames forward. Now, when you first start adding particles to your scene, I suggest you not use the play button because you can lock your scene up. Also, you're going to want to save frequently, but to prevent your scene from locking up for whatever reason in the simulation, which will happen to you, and then you'll lose work, you want to hit the next button and pay attention to see how long it takes to go to the next frame. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we want to make this text melt. And when we think of something melting, you're going to get these slow initial melting period of it going really slowly and kind of peeling away. And then you're off that, the really hotter sections are going to peel away quicker. So we're going to have a couple layers here. And then from those, we want to emit even more liquidy drips. So we'll have 2 melt, some drips. And then when it makes this pool of liquid goo, we want lumps in the pool. So those are treated as 4 different things. And that'll kind of help you break down the system that we're going to be building. So for the first thing we want to add is we want gravity to affect this particle group. So I selected the particle group and I'm going to go down here to gravity and hold shift and click on gravity. It adds it to the group, and I'm going to bring down this because this is going to be our slow melt. So I'll set it to something like 10 and I'll call this gravity slow. And I'm going to turn off the volume builder and then I'm going to just play it. You have to hit back and you can see it slowly falls. I'm also going to add 250 frames so we have more time, and you can see it slowly drops. But we want to confine this into kind of a dripping manner. And to do that, what we're going to pick is a field that picks certain spots at random to melt and peel away. So we'll go to the field of the gravity here and I'll pick the shader field and we'll pick a shader of noise, and I'll go into the noise and I want to add contrast. I'm going to go to something like 90 and let's see what we get. You can see it's just randomly picking a pattern to peel away. Now we want this to kind of melt from these spots and then animate outwards to kind of make all of this fall. So what we'll do is we'll go to the brightness and I'm going to look here. Let's try 38 and you can see there's a couple little specks. So I'll go 2 more and now they're gone. And so I'll go to frame 0 and I want this to start animating immediately. So I'll click brightness, keyframe. Notice no particles fall. I'm going to go to something like 120 and then pull this up, the brightness. So I had it at -40. I'm going to do +40. So you get white pixels. There we go. Hit a keyframe and let's see what we got. And there we go. So you can see we get some drips. I'm going to change the keyframe type. So I'll select the noise and I'll set it to linear so it has no easing. And I'm also going to take my gravity and in this brightness, I'm going to set it a little bit longer. Let's do 140. And you can play with these later. Don't get hung up on getting it exact the first round. Okay, so what we want to do is these parts that initially start dripping, we want them to go quicker and start peeling away faster. Also, you can see it's falling through the floor. So let's adjust that first. So we want to start seeing the pool happen. So in this particle group, we need to add the collider. By default, the floor is not going to collide even though it has a collider tag on it, because that particle group, we need to show it with a collide object. So I'm going to hold shift and add it to the particle group because it's selected. And you want to put the collider at the very bottom. If you have it before the gravity, it will not work properly. And you can see it's now nicely pooling at the bottom and they're falling onto themselves. Okay, so let's get this to drip better. So what we want to do is we have a situation where we want to say, if the particles travel a certain distance, be more liquidy. So what we'll do is we'll add a condition. We'll drag it in between the gravity and the collider. And what we want to do is we want to see the condition happen. So what I want to add to it is a color mapper. So I'm going to hold shift and add it to the condition. And I'm going to get rid of the colors here. And I'll leave this red for now so we can see it change. And we want to say, hey, property, age. We want to change it to distance traveled. when the distance is traveled, we want to compare it to be greater than or equals a certain value. Let's do 5. So if I play this, once those particles move and fall down, you see how they turn red? Let's do 10 so they kind of drip a little bit more on the slower rate. And now what we'll do is we'll say, when they travel this distance and they start turning red, make it more liquidy. So with the condition property modifier set, we're gonna hold shift and add another gravity to it. And you can see this condition acts like a folder. So I'll drag the gravity below the color mapper. And this time we'll set the gravity to 25. And also, because we're using multiple gravities, we wanna set the gravity to the first one to force and the second gravity to force as well. So let's see what we get. And you can see they start falling quicker. I'm also going to change the condition to be something like 20. So they kind of move slower and then they activate. And you can play with these values. We're just roughing and blocking things in. So don't get hung up wasting time getting the perfect parameters because we'll have a lot going on here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to make these look like liquid. So right now, it doesn't feel like liquid. Those red particles don't feel like they're kind of coming down and coagulating. So to this condition property, we're gonna add a flock profile. And this modifier is gonna kind of fake the liquid effects because we don't have access to a full fluid solver. We're gonna use the flock modifier. So I'll hold shift, click, I'll add it below the color mapper and above the gravity. And the gravity should be the bottom and the collider should always be the bottom. So with this flock property, what we want to do is we'll leave everything to its default. And what we want to mess with first is the cohesion, which means pulling together. I know I want to pull them together, max it out, and I want to set this to something like 10. So 10 centimeters and less will pull together. But the separation, this will keep the particles from falling on top of each other. So if I leave this to 1, this will keep them 1 unit apart from each other. I also don't want them to fall apart, come too close too quick. So I'm going to set it to 0.5 and let's see what we get. And we should get some stringy behavior. See how they pull together, start dropping? And you'll notice the fluid bounces. So let's fix that. So I'm going to go to the floor collider and make sure the bounce is not selected. And also on the collider here, turn this down. We also want to have a little bit of friction. So I'll set it to something like 20 and you can leave everything default. And let's just check it one more time. You can see that it kind of pools on itself and it doesn't fill up a volume like you'd expect at the floor. So what we'll need to do is we want to make these particles separate when they get on the floor. So to do that, what we're going to do is we need to basically kind of cordon off a section at the very bottom. And to do that, instead of using the condition, we're going to use the field condition. So I'll add it. And what this does is we'll add it just below the condition that we first added and above the collider. And what we'll do is we want to mask off a certain area. And to do that, we'll use a linear field and we'll set it to -y because we want to work from down from a specific area. And I'm going to set this to something really low like 2 and I'll just drag it up a little bit. So if I go 1 frame forward, you can see this will be the height of that melting section at the base. So what do we want to have happen in this field condition? We want to use the flock to kind of push those particles apart. So I'll hold shift and I'll add it below the linear field because that's what we first want to happen, and then the flock. And we'll go to the flock here and we want to reduce the cohesion to like 0.5 and set this to 10 and see how that works. And then the separation, we'll leave it 2.5 and see what we get. And you can see they kind of separate, but we now have these glumps happening and you can see they're separated. And so depending on the details and the amount of particles that you have in your scene, you might need to separate these values some. So let's bring the strength down so we don't get that exploding effect. And then what we're going to do is we don't want this flock to immediately start. So that's why we brought the strength down. And so when these start emitting, we're going to just go a couple frames forward. Let's try 40. Right when it starts melting up here, we'll then add a strength amount and move it forward and say 1. So now it's going to start pooling out. We'll bring this out a little bit more. See, it starts melting at the bottom and it's still a little explosive. So let's just pull down the separation strength back down to 1. And let's set this to something like 2 because that's our voxel size. And there we go. So you can see it now pulls out. So let's see how this looks with the volume builder on it. And it's looking all right, but what we want to do is we want to smooth this out a little bit. It looks pretty chaotic. Let's check this out and see if it'll play back at real time. Now this is a strain on your computer to have the volume field going at the same time, but you can see we get nice drips. So I'll go to somewhere right here and in the volume builder, I'll add a smoother. And also I want more control. So what I'm going to do is instead of adding a smoother, I'm going to set this to fog. And this allows us to get better results because you'll notice we can add a lot more field types and smoothers. And we'll bring down the voxel distance. And I'm going to set this to 1.5. And you'll notice our text is showing these green pixels, these points, and kind of exposing. So I'm going to take a smoother and maybe try 50% value and also just boost the radius just a couple notches more. So they line up right. I'm doing 2.5, right to where they just hide the green voxels. So I hit back. You can see it starts melting, starts softening. And that's looking delicious. And what we want to do is we want to have particles coming off these bigger drips. This is looking really nice. So I'm going to turn off the particle group visibility so we can see what's going on. That feels really nice. And if you want to make these blotches, these parts that are melting bigger, you just go into the first gravity shader field and change this value on the global scale. So if I do 200, you're going to get bigger chunks falling out. Also, we can say the gravity, we can bring it down to something like 6. So it initially drips slower. See that? That feels good. So off of these drips, I want to have more particles coming down from those drips that are smaller and more detailed, but this looks good. So what we'll do is to do that in this condition, we want to make more particles emit. So in this condition, let's turn this back on and turn off our volume builder so it comes in quicker. From these big red drips, I want smaller details. So to do that, in the condition, we're going to add a reproduce. So I'll hold shift and this adds a reproduce generator particle group and a particle group itself. So I'm going to take this particle group and drag it below the field condition so that after the condition here, in fact, we can add it in between here. We want drips. So this reproduce, I'll call this reproduce small drips. And let's set these up properly. So these smaller drips, we're going to leave it on per particle and we're going to leave everything to its default for now. And in this particle group, I'm going to name the particle group drips. And inside this particle group, if I just play it, we look, they're emitting off the back. By default, they're going to go in the Z direction. So these pink pixels are going to be set up incorrectly. What we do is we select the reproduce node and we want to change the speed to 0. And we'll say direction inheritance and speed inheritance to 100% so that they move in the same direction as their parent. So you can see these are the new particles. We want to make them smaller and coagulate. So to do that, we're going to add to this particle group drip. Let's add a gravity. So shift click and let's set this to, I don't know, 200. Set the dynamics to force. And for ease sake, the drips, we can change the color to blue. And you can see they just fall. They don't pull together. And that's because in the group of these small drips, we need to pull them together. So to do that, we'll use the flock again and same settings as before. The separation, we'll have it set to 2 or let's do 1. So they're nice and tight. And we'll set the amount to 0.5 so they separate slower. And the cohesion we'll set to 10 and the cohesion strength, we'll try something like 5. So it pulls them together quickly. And if you haven't saved, go ahead and save now so you don't crash and lose your work. So there's our smaller drips. We're going to take the cohesion and crank it up to something like 25. So we get individual groups, and let's set this to 12. I want smaller little drips. See how they come into little drips now? And if I turn on the volume builder, you can see that the blue particles, which are the sub drips, are not being extruded and being shown in the volume builder. So to do that, we'll go to the volume builder and we'll add our drips in there above the fog smoother. We'll turn this off for a second. So let's see what it looks like smoothed. And there we go. So there's those individual drips. Now, when it comes time to rendering, I suggest you bring this down to 1 so you get more detail happening. And if you need to smooth it, you just increase this value. But you're going to want a lot of polygons because you will notice that there's some weird voxelization happening and you'll see it. Also, our base looks too chunky. So we'll go to the field condition here and we'll bring the separation strength to 0.5. And I'm going to bring down the noise strength so we don't get that crazy noisy look. The base turn off and the base looks good. So the drips are noticing that they're falling through. So what we need to do is in our small group, drips group, we'll take the collide object and drag it in as well, just below the gravity so that it applies to that as well. Hit back. And now it's looking nice. You can see the drips hit first. Okay, so the particle so far is looking pretty good. Now, there's a lot of details that we could be adding to this that I'm not going to go through, but I'll give you some points and some tips. So we've got areas that we can adjust, like we can make the green particles transition time longer so it hangs lower. That's one option. You can melt the different speeds at different rates. One thing that we have not discussed is the particle stretching. So what we can do is we can look at the particle's velocity and stretch the polygons in the direction of the velocity. And to do that, it's quite simple. I'll turn on the polygon here. And so when this falls, there's going to be some speed and we'll want some pixel stretching. And to do that, you select your volume builder and you select your particle group drips. And then you've got this velocity scale. If you set it to 1, it's going to get really crazy and stretch a lot. So what you want to do is you're going to want to do like 0.1 and less, very small amounts. So we can try 0.2, it might be too much. And I'll go to my other group here and set this to 0.1 as well. I found 0.1 seems to be the right amount. So that's the stretch, and then I'm going to zero it out so you can see what it's doing. It stretches those voxels down. So I'm going to set it to point. I'm looking at this one because I'm stretching the small drips just to get the right length. I think 0.1 seems to be the best and lower. There we go. Okay, so I've got the voxel size set pretty low. I'm going to put it back to 2. And then if you run into this issue where they disappear, you need to go to your particle group here and then bring this value up until it shows up. So right at 3. And that'll smooth things out too. Then we'll go to our small group, put that to 3. And there you go. So experiment with the velocity scale. Just know that you're going to want to put it at very low numbers like 0.1, 0.2, 0.05, somewhere around there. The next thing I wanted to show you is I'm going to turn off the voxels here and let this play out. And you can see, if we look at the blue particles, that's this small drips one. The flock is a little too tight. So I'm going to set this to 2, which is our voxel size, and set this to let's do 0.75. There we go. Now, if you want chunkier base, where when it makes the pool, you have some chunks, what you can do, I'll let this play out and then you can see the problem that we're going to run into. I'm going to pause it and then look at my volume builder here. It's looking cool. Now we can add more detail in the bump map when it comes time to texturing, but this has a nice feel. What you can also do is you can add another condition in here, or sorry, another in the particle group up here. So if I close this, just below this gravity that's called gravity slow, I can take this, duplicate it, and add another shader field, come in here and change the number and do a smaller noise. So I set it to 200. I can bring this back down to 100. Okay, so I played it just a little bit and I'm not having this issue, but if if you run into a case where your pool at the very bottom is not lumpy enough, like you want more chunks, I don't have that issue because of the speed in which the particles are falling. But if you do have it, so there's no pool and it kind of just comes into a thin patty, here's what you can do. You can go to the field condition. In fact, I'll name this floor. And what we can do is we can add to it a friction. So I'm going to hold shift, add it after the flock. And so the friction, we can crank up to 100 and then add a shader field to it, add a noise. And depending on how big you want these lumps, you can do this and just add a little bit of contrast to it. And this will create variation. So once it hits the floor area above this, below this linear field, it will move in different thicknesses and you'll have to play with this friction. So once you get to the point where you like this and you want to verify that it plays back, because right now it's going to play back really, really slow. What we can do is we can come in here and do a new render setting, call it hardware or preview or something like that. You have to activate it by clicking this. And we're not going to do a image sequence. We're going to just do an MP4, and I'll go to my format here and I'll set the bit rate to something like 50,000, set the link of where I want to save it to. And this will be a video instead of an image sequence. And this is the only time that I actually render out videos from Redshift. It's just when I'm doing these hardware previews. So then the last step, we'll click Redshift and we'll change it to viewport render. We can delete the magic bullet or viewport render. What we want to do is we want to go to filter and say geometry only. And then what we can do is we can add to it the AO, and we don't need the other ones. We're not doing any texturing, so we'll just leave it the default like this. And then you hit render and it'll render you out a video. Oh, one last thing too. I want to go to the output and set it to 1920 by 1080. And if it's for a client and you want it to look nicer, you can turn on anti-aliasing, and I'll usually max it out and then bring it up to 2 on the sub sampling. And there you go. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out to show you what my status is. So I'll be right back. So now that we've done a hardware play blast, you can see it really reveals a lot of issues, mainly with these drips. They appear as though they're just kind of disappearing. And that's because of has to do with hierarchy and particle groups. So let's go ahead and address that now. So remember how I said these particle groups, they're treated as folders and they encapsulate the effects. So you've got a particle group and then another particle group inside. What's happening is the floor, conditioned floor, is only affecting this particle group. It is encapsulating and blocking off these drips from being affected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and drag this outside, and it'll make it much easier to see what's going on. So you can see when I close it, we've got this particle group, which is reproducing particles and being brought into this group. So this field condition is not working. So what we'll do is we'll take this field condition floor and drag a copy of it. So I'm going to hold down Control and drag it in above the collide and below the gravity. And now it's going to be affecting. And what we'll do is we'll change the flock. So if I go back to the video, you can see that when the particles hit the floor, they get really compressed and flattened. So the drips, we need the flocking to pull the particles together, but once they get down here, we can spread it out. And this flock, I've set to cohesion of 5 millimeters. So they're not pulling from bigger distances anymore. And we'll set the radius here to 0.1. So it goes to 1 because it goes faster. And we'll leave the separation radius to that. Is on this field condition, I want to see that those particle groups are being activated. So just as a visual guide. So I'm going to change in this field condition floor of the drips particle group. I'm going to add a condition called color mapper, control click, bring it up to the top. The color mapper, I'm going to get rid of these colors here and I'll just leave it. I'll make it bright yellow so it's easy to see. Let's play it. Now our goal is to get these drips to match this gooiness here. And you can see they're spreading out and they're still getting flat. So let's figure this out. So I'm going to go to the flock here and I'll bring this up to 2. We can also get rid of the strength. I'm going to go to right click, animation, delete track so that those drips will condense and be affected immediately. There you go. So now you can see there's some height. So this will render out properly. So I just turned up the separation strength a little bit more to 3. And I want to keep the separation set to 2 because that's what the other melt are set to. One of the things that we're running into is the particles, these secondary particles called small drips, is pancaking. And the reason it's doing that is because of the gravity that's being applied. You can see it's set to 200 to get it to fall quicker. Well, what we can do is in the floor linear field that we have set up, we can add another gravity. So shift click, add it below the flock. And what we can do is we can put it back to 10, which is our initial weight, gravity weight of the first green particles. And that's going to help keep the compression down. You can see the height is significantly taller now, so that when we see the height, before it was flat. So we're just reducing the gravity so it's not pulling down so hard once it gets down to the floor. I think this is a good jumping off point to create your own special melt text effect. Remember, we can swap out the asset to be any object essentially, as long as it's the correct scene scale. You have so much you can adjust. What I suggest you do is your plan of attack is going to be make an adjustment, then do a hardware preview. Make an adjustment, do a hardware preview. And when you're doing this, make sure you save frequently and don't change any of the parameters while it's playing. You can crash the machine. So save often. I hope you found this intro to particles and melting objects useful. Thanks so much. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.